For more than 1,000 years, a single conviction was etched into the very marrow of every human being. Rome is eternal. This city was not merely a location on a map. It was the ultimate manifestation of civilization, the physical embodiment of the absolute power that humanity could achieve. The Romans believed that as long as the heart of Rome continued to beat, the world would remain in its proper order. But in the 5th century, the unthinkable occurred. One morning, the sun rose as it always had, yet the empire had simply vanished. Have you ever wondered how a massive machine, a network of powers spanning the entire Mediterranean, could collapse in a single blink of historical time? Or more terrifyingly, are we repeating the very same errors that led to its extinction without even realizing it? Close your eyes and journey back through the fog of time. Imagine standing in the center of the Roman Forum at its absolute zenith. Feel the thunder of chariot wheels on flawless stone roads and breathe in the scent of incense wafting from marble temples. This was the world's first truly global network. Yet, behind this veil of magnificence, an invisible killer was already gnawing at the foundations of the empire. It was not the swords of the barbarian tribes that posed the greatest threat, but a rot from within, a lethal, quiet complacency. We often envision collapse as a sudden, violent explosion, but for Rome, it was a long, agonizing sigh of an entity exhausted by its own weight. In this exploration, we will do more than recount dates. We are here to decode the DNA of collapse. Why did a civilization possessing superior technology, a sophisticated legal system, and an invincible military disintegrate? I will reveal a truth that history books often bury. Rome did not fall. It committed suicide. As we peel back the layers of this mystery, you will encounter a terrifying paradox. The very warning signs that signaled Rome's disappearance are reappearing in our modern world today. This is not a story about distant emperors or ancient battles. This is a mirror held up to our own survival. It is a journey to uncover how our world was shaped from the smoldering ashes of a fallen giant. Let us begin our descent into the shadows, returning to the peak before the abyss, to understand why an empire that was supposed to last forever simply ceased to be. To understand how an empire vanishes, we must first look at the mask it wears. In the early 4th and 5th centuries, if you were a citizen of Rome, you lived in a world of breathtaking luxury. You walked through streets lined with gold-flecked monuments, attended games where wealth was thrown like candy to the masses, and felt the protection of walls that had never been breached. But this was a phantom peak. Behind the marble facades, a silent parasite was devouring the empire's soul. History books often focus on the barbarians at the gate, but the real silent executioner was already inside the palace, the treasury, and the hearts of the people. The first sign of the end wasn't a battle. It was an invisible theft. For generations, the Roman government committed a crime against its own future. They debased their currency. To pay for a military that grew too large and a bureaucracy that became too greedy, emperors began to thin out the silver in their coins. What was once pure became a cheap alloy. It was a slow-motion suicide of the economy. Prices skyrocketed, while the value of a man's labor withered into nothing. The people didn't realize that their prosperity was an illusion, a house of cards waiting for the slightest breeze to send it tumbling down. But the rot went deeper than gold. It reached the very DNA of the Roman spirit. The grit and discipline that had built the Republic were replaced by a lethal apathy. The elites became obsessed with suns and statues, losing themselves in a cycle of endless indulgence and political games, while the common citizens felt abandoned by the state. The bond between the protector and the protected was severed. Rome had become a giant with hollow bones. It still looked powerful. Its shadow still stretched across continents. But inside, the structure had turned to dust. While the heart of Rome grew cold, its borders became a sieve. The legendary legions, the finest fighting force the world had ever known, were no longer composed of Romans fighting for their homes. They were replaced by mercenaries, men whose loyalty could be bought and sold by the highest bidder. The invincible shield was now held by hands that had no stake in Rome's survival. We are taught to fear the other, the invader from the outside. But the tragedy of Rome reminds us of a much darker truth. A civilization is rarely destroyed by a stranger's sword until it has first destroyed itself from within. As the sun began to set on the 400s, the stage was set for the final act. The invisible killer had finished its work. All that was needed now was a single, violent push to make the eternal city disappear forever. While Rome was rotting from within, the horizon was beginning to darken with a different kind of storm. For centuries, the Rhine and Danube rivers had served as the world's most formidable boundaries, the Iron Curtain of the ancient world. But by the late 300s and early 400s, this barrier started to groan under an unprecedented pressure. This was the Great Migration, a massive, chaotic wave of humanity pushed by a terror even greater than the Roman legions. From the deep, cold forests of the north and the vast, sunless plains of the east, entire nations were on the move. They weren't just soldiers, they were refugees, men, women, and children, fleeing a darkness they couldn't name. Imagine the Roman border not as a static wall, but as a dam holding back a rising ocean. For years, the empire had dealt with these barbarians by hiring them, settling them, and playing them against each other. But the ocean was now too deep, and the dam was riddled with cracks. The very people Rome had brought in as mercenaries to guard the gates were now looking back at their cousins on the other side. The invincible shield was no longer made of Roman steel, but of Germanic iron. The boundary between us and them had blurred until it became meaningless. You might wonder, as you look at our modern world, how often we rely on the very forces that could eventually replace us. What Rome didn't realize was that these tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, were not invading by choice. They were being hunted. Out of the vast steppes of Asia, a new, invisible killer had emerged, the Huns, led by a shadow that would soon be known as the Scourge of God. These horsemen were a force of nature that shattered everything in their path. The Germanic tribes were the first dominoes to fall, and they fell directly onto Rome. The empire was no longer facing a series of raids. It was facing a tidal wave of desperate, armed souls who had nowhere else to go. The first true crack appeared in the winter of 406. Legend tells of a night so cold that the mighty Rhine River, the empire's liquid wall, froze solid. Thousands of Vandals and Alans walked across the ice, stepping onto Roman soil, without a single sword being drawn to stop them. The eternal border had been breached by the weather itself. This was the moment the illusion of safety finally shattered. The sacred ground of the empire was no longer sacred. It was a hunting ground. As these shadows moved deeper into the heartland, the citizens of Rome finally looked up from their games and their gold. They saw the smoke on the horizon. They felt the ground tremble. The silent executioner from the inside had finally met the storm from the outside. The stage was set for the most unthinkable event in human history, the day the walls of the eternal city itself would fail. On the night of August 24th, 410, the world held its breath. For nearly 800 years, the city of Rome had remained untouched, a sanctuary of stone, law, and myth that seemed to exist outside the reach of time. Generation after generation had lived and died, believing that while empires might rise and fall on the frontier, the heart of the world was invincible. But then the unthinkable occurred. The Salarian Gate, one of the massive lungs of the city, did not fail under the blow of a barbarian battering ram. It was open from the inside. This was the invisible killer in its most terrifying form, betrayal. Alaric and his Visigoths didn't just enter a city. They entered the DNA of Western belief and shattered it into 1,000 pieces. For 3 days, the eternal city bled. The streets that once echoed with the sophisticated debates of senators were filled with the screams of a civilization realizing it was mortal. This was the ultimate twist, the moment the unsinkable myth hit the iceberg of reality. The psychological shockwaves traveled faster than any messenger. In a cell in Bethlehem, the great scholar Jerome wept, famously writing, "The city which has taken the whole world is itself taken." He understood what many today still struggle to grasp. When the heart of a system stops, the entire body, no matter how vast, begins to grow cold. The sack of 410 was not a total destruction, but it was a symbolic death. The Roman machine, once thought to be a perpetual motion device of power and progress, had finally ground to a halt. The infrastructure of belief was gone. People looked at the smoke rising from the Palatine Hill and faced a terrifying information gap. If Rome could fall, who was safe? This was the birth of a global FOMO of survival, a collective realization that the world as they knew it was ending and they were being left behind in the dark. The silent executioner had finally stopped the clock of the ancient world. The tragedy of 410 teaches us that the greatest price a civilization pays is often for its own complacency. Rome had traded its freedom for speed and its vigilance for luxury, only to find that when the crisis arrived, it had nothing left to defend itself with but hollow stone. As the Visigoths marched out of the city gates, laden with gold, but leaving behind a shattered spirit, the eternal city was no longer eternal. It was a ghost, and in that haunting silence, the first seeds of the Dark Ages began to take root in the very soil that had once birthed emperors. If the sack of 410 was a psychological tremor, the mid-5th century was the earthquake that finally swallowed the empire's foundation. For decades after the first fall, Rome existed as a wounded giant, desperately trying to stitch its limbs back together. But a new invisible killer had emerged, and this time it wasn't attacking the walls. It was attacking the stomach. In 439, the unthinkable happened. The Vandals, a Germanic tribe that had migrated all the way to North Africa, captured Carthage. North Africa was the breadbasket of Rome. It was the lifeblood that kept the city's millions fed and its economy breathing. The loss of these lands created a financial black hole from which the empire could never escape. Suddenly, the gold stopped flowing, and more importantly, the grain ships stopped arriving. This was the ultimate twist of history. The greatest empire on earth was brought to its knees not just by iron, but by hunger. As the food disappeared, so did the last remnants of social order. Rome was no longer a vibrant hive of activity. It was becoming a dead land of starving shadows. In 455, the Vandals arrived at the gates of Rome itself. But this was not the chaotic raid of 410. This was a systematic, cold-blooded stripping of a corpse. For 14 days, the Vandals didn't just loot gold. They took the very copper from the roofs and the statues from the pedestals. They left the city a hollow shell. This was the moment of total disintegration, where the information gap between what Rome claimed to be and what it actually was became an unbridgeable canyon. The citizens realized they were living in a ghost story. The silent executioner had moved from the palace to the pantry, leaving behind a city that had forgotten how to be an empire. The loss of North Africa and the sack of 455 represented a shattering of the spirit. Rome was now a prisoner in its own home, surrounded by a world that had moved on. The DNA of Roman power had been rewritten by poverty and isolation. We must ask ourselves, what happens to a civilization when it loses its ability to provide the basic needs of its people? When the financial black hole swallows the future, all that remains is the echoing silence of a vanishing world. By the 460s and 470s, the Western Roman Empire was no longer a functioning state. It was a ghost ship adrift in a violent sea. The grand palaces of the Palatine Hill were cold, inhabited by puppet emperors, men with illustrious names who possessed only the authority of a shadow. This was the silent executioner of legitimacy. Behind these hollow figures stood the true masters, Germanic generals who treated Roman emperors like disposable masks. This was the ultimate twist of Roman history. The very men hired to defend the empire had become its jailers. In 475, a boy was placed on the throne, his name a tragic irony, Romulus Augustulus. He carried the name of Rome's legendary founder and its first great emperor, but he possessed neither their strength nor their destiny. He was a child king in a world of wolves. This was the peak before the abyss, the final, fragile moment before the Roman name simply ceased to mean anything at all. The DNA of Rome, the spirit of law and order that had spanned a millennium, was now so diluted that it was unrecognizable to the ancestors who had built it. The end came not with a grand battle or a dramatic siege, but with a simple demand for land and pay. Odoacer, a Germanic soldier who had risen through the ranks of the Roman military, realized the greatest secret of the 5th century. The emperor was an unnecessary expense. In September 476, Odoacer marched into Ravenna, the swamp-protected capital of the West. He did not kill the boy Romulus. He simply pensioned him off to a villa in the countryside. He then gathered the imperial regalia, the purple cloak and the golden crown, and sent them to the emperor in the east with a message that shattered the world. The West no longer needs its own emperor. This was the moment the invisible enemy of irrelevance finally claimed its prize. The empire didn't die in a blaze of glory. It was simply deleted from reality. As Odoacer declared himself king of Italy, the 1,200-year-old dream of Rome vanished into the fog of the Middle Ages. We must look at this silence and ask, what happens to our own institutions when they become mere masks for power? When the invisible assassin of apathy replaces the spirit of a nation? How long until our own puppet emperors are told they are no longer required? Imagine waking up in a world where the law has simply evaporated. For the common person living through the late 400s, the fall of Rome wasn't a headline. It was a slow, terrifying transition into a dead land. The sun still rose over the Mediterranean, and the harvest still needed to be gathered, but the DNA of safety that had protected their ancestors for generations was gone. This was the silent executioner of isolation. Without the legions to guard the roads, the world became a much larger, much more dangerous place. A journey to the next town, once a routine trip on paved Roman stone, was now a gamble with death. The infrastructure of civilization began to rot from the edges. The great aqueducts, those stone arteries that brought life to the cities, began to leak and fail because no one remembered how to fix them. This was the information gap in its most brutal form, a generation of people surrounded by the wonders of the past that they no longer knew how to operate. This was the ultimate twist of the collapse. Humanity was living in the ruins of a future they had already lost. Knowledge became the next invisible killer, as literacy plummeted and the great libraries fell silent, turning the eternal light of Rome into the long, cold shadow of the Dark Ages. The social fabric didn't just tear, it was rewoven into something much more primitive. People traded their freedom for the protection of local warlords, the first seeds of the feudal system. This was the invisible assassin of the trade-off. In exchange for a wall and a sword to guard them, the people gave up their rights as Roman citizens. They were no longer part of a global empire. They were prisoners of their own geography. The DNA of Rome, the belief in a universal law, was replaced by a raw DNA of survival. As you look at the complexities of our modern interconnected world, ask yourself, what happens when the stone arteries we rely on, our internet, our power grids, our supply chains, suddenly stop working? Will we know how to fix the world we built? As the cities emptied and the forests reclaimed the Roman roads, a new world was being born in the darkness. It was a world of hard labor, superstition, and local loyalties. Rome had vanished, but its ghost remained, haunting the minds of those who still whispered its name in the ruins. We look back at the 5th century as a distant tragedy, a moment when a global empire simply evaporated into the fog of the past. But if you look closely at the world outside your window today, you will realize a terrifying truth. Rome never truly vanished. It merely changed its form. The DNA of the empire is still circulating in our collective veins. It is in the languages we use to express our deepest thoughts, the legal systems that govern our societies, and the very architecture of our global, interconnected civilization. This is the final twist of our journey. We're not just studying history, we are looking into a mirror. The silent executioner that ended the Roman dream, the rot of complacency, the financial black hole of unsustainable debt, and the dangerous trade-off of freedom for temporary speed, is still very much stalking our halls today. We have built a world of lightning-fast technology and digital wonders, but we have also inherited the Roman paradox. A civilization is only as strong as the spirit that defends it. When that spirit fails, when the information gap between those who lead and those who follow grows too wide, the infrastructure of civilization begins to crumble, just as the stone aqueducts did 1,600 years ago. The disappearance of Rome in the 400s serves as a terrifying warning that no empire is too big to fail, and no civilization is eternal by birthright. Its end was not a sudden accident. It was the inevitable consequence of decisions made 200 years before the first barbarian ever crossed the Rhine. As we navigate our own uncertain century, we must decide if we will listen to the ghosts of the past, or if we're simply waiting for our own gates to be opened from the within. Rome's fall reminds us that the greatest price we pay is for our own apathy. But it also offers a glimmer of hope. From the ashes of the greatest collapse in history, the modern world was eventually born. Thank you for walking through these ruins with me. If this story has helped you understand why our world functions the way it does, then the legacy of Rome is still alive. The final question remains for you to ponder. Has our progress truly made us happier, or are we simply building more magnificent ruins for the future to find? I am Chronicle, watching the past so we can understand the present. And together, we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.